You could be driving exactly the way you always have. Same route, same habits, same confidence that you're following the rules. And then in a single moment, one decision, one misunderstanding, you could find yourself facing a penalty so large it doesn't feel real. Not because you intended to break the law, but because there's a rule on the books that most drivers never fully learn until it's too late. And by the time you're aware of it, the financial consequences may already be in motion. So here's the question. Do you think it's fair for a single traffic law violation to carry penalties that can reach thousands of dollars if the average driver doesn't clearly understand the rule? Let me know your answer in the comments. Now let's slow this down and examine what's actually happening here, because when people hear about a $10,000 traffic law, it often sounds exaggerated, but in reality, certain violations can carry cumulative penalties that reach that level under specific conditions. In my legal analysis, traffic penalties in the United States are rarely defined by a single flat number. Instead, they are built through layers: base fines, court costs, administrative fees, insurance impacts, and in some cases, civil liability. What starts as a relatively standard violation can escalate depending on the circumstances, the jurisdiction, and the driver's history. Historically, traffic enforcement began with modest fines intended to encourage compliance. But as road systems became more complex and the consequences of unsafe driving became more severe, states expanded penalty structures. This included higher fines for certain behaviors, especially those considered high risk, such as reckless driving, failure to comply with lawful orders, or violations involving safety zones. Courts would likely examine these penalty structures under the principle that the state has a legitimate interest in promoting safety. That means penalties can be significant as long as they are proportionate to the risk or harm associated with the violation. Now let's bring in the constitutional framework, because this is where many people assume there are stronger limits than actually exist. Driving is generally treated as a regulated privilege rather than a fundamental constitutional right. That distinction allows states to impose conditions, requirements, and penalties that might not be permissible in other areas of law. The Fourth Amendment becomes relevant when enforcement involves a traffic stop. Officers must have reasonable suspicion to initiate that stop, and the scope of the interaction must remain within legal boundaries. If a violation leads to a search or further investigation, courts would likely examine whether that expansion was justified. The Fifth Amendment may also come into play if statements made during a stop are later used in legal proceedings. Drivers retain protections, but those protections operate within structured legal limits. In my legal analysis, the most important takeaway is that constitutional protections focus more on how laws are enforced rather than how severe the penalties are, as long as those penalties are authorized by statute. Now, when we talk about a law that can cost up to $10,000, we are often referring to situations where multiple consequences combine. For example, a serious violation might include a base fine, additional penalties if it occurred in a designated zone, increased insurance premiums over time, and potential civil liability if property damage or injury is involved. That's where the real-world impact becomes clear. A driver may initially receive what seems like a manageable fine, but over months or years the financial effect can multiply. Insurance adjustments alone can significantly increase long-term costs, especially if the violation is classified as high risk. Supporters of these penalty structures argue that they serve as a strong deterrent. The idea is that higher consequences encourage more cautious behavior, which ultimately reduces accidents and protects public safety. Critics, however, often question whether such high cumulative penalties are always proportionate, especially in cases where the violation did not result in harm. They argue that clarity and education should play a larger role in compliance, rather than relying heavily on financial deterrence. Courts would likely focus on whether the law is clearly written and consistently applied. They generally do not evaluate whether the penalty feels fair in a broad sense, but whether it aligns with legislative intent and constitutional standards. Now let's talk about practical consequences for drivers. The most immediate impact is financial, but it doesn't stop there. Accumulated violations can affect a driver's record, potentially leading to license restrictions or suspension depending on the jurisdiction. Even a single high-level violation can have lasting effects. In my legal analysis, the real risk is not just the initial penalty, it's the long-term consequences that follow. Many drivers underestimate how one incident can influence their legal and financial situation over time. There's also a compliance factor to consider. When laws are not widely understood, drivers may unintentionally place themselves at risk. That's why awareness becomes just as important as behavior. Knowing the rules allows you to make informed decisions in situations that may not seem significant at first. Now let's step back and look at the broader policy reality. Traffic laws continue to evolve, and enforcement methods are becoming more precise. As technology improves, states are better able to track violations, apply penalties, and manage records. This increases efficiency, but it also raises expectations for drivers to stay informed. In my legal analysis, lawmakers face an ongoing challenge, balancing enforcement strength with public understanding. A law is only as effective as the clarity with which it is communicated and applied. Looking ahead, the long-term implication is clear. Drivers will need to become more proactive in understanding the rules that govern them, not because laws are becoming unfair, but because they are becoming more detailed and interconnected. Courts would likely continue to uphold these systems as long as they remain within constitutional boundaries and serve a legitimate public purpose. And that brings us to the final thought. The biggest risk on the road isn't always speed or distraction. It can be uncertainty. Not knowing how a law applies or how a small action might be interpreted can have consequences far beyond what most people expect. So think about this carefully. Do you believe high financial penalties are the most effective way to ensure safer driving? Or should more emphasis be placed on education and awareness before enforcement? Share your thoughts in the comments. A thoughtful conversation helps bring clarity to laws that impact millions of drivers every single day. And if you want clear, legally grounded explanations of rules that directly affect your daily life, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Because in the end, the road isn't just about where you're going. It's about understanding the legal responsibilities that guide every decision you make along the way.